In this video, we're going to be going over some hip extension pails and rails. We're going to be using a bench setup for this so we can really isolate and block the hip in our end range of motion. You don't necessarily have to have this style of bench, but you do need some type of bench that has some type of adjustability to it. Even if this seat is fixed, will still work just fine. We want to have some angle that matches where our hip extension is. So if you are somebody who's very limited, you might need a more vertical bench. If you're somebody who has a lot of play in hip extension, maybe you can have this angle a little bit lower. Regardless, it's going to be a fairly small adjustment. The biggest thing that we need to make sure when we set this up is the pelvic tilt, so posterior tilt. So we're going to get up against the bench here. You can hold your body up against it. It's probably going to be your best bet. For right now, I'm going to cue a little off the bench. So your core is going to be nice and tight. We're going to sniff in some air and pack that air in and get this irradiation into the core. And then we are going to scoop the pelvis and tuck the hips to try to find our stretch. Now we keep the core tight initially as we find our stretch to make sure that we pull the tissue from the appropriate place. If we're all loosey-goosey, chances are that we might not get as specific as we need to. So we're going to lock this in once we have our stretch, and once we are certain we have our stretch, we're going to settle in and we're going to sit in this stretch for 1 to 2 minutes, possibly longer, depending on what we've recommended for you. So you should be feeling this stretch in the front of the hip, high towards the hip bone, potentially. You may feel it in the quad if you're really, really tight, but that's where we want it, and you may even feel it up into the lower parts of the core a little bit. So after we've made it through our 1 to 2 minute stretch, and we've really settled in and felt some passive length come into this hip, we're going to first re-sniff in air. We're going to pack that air down. We're going to really lock the body in. I'm going to hang on tight to the bench here. The leg I'm standing on is going to irradiate with tension and be very solid. And then we are going to start to very lightly drive the knee against the bench. And there should be absolutely no movement in the body as you do this. This is a pure isometric contraction. We'll start very, very light, and we will ramp up to your absolute safest, greatest effort trying to crush through this bench. And it should take you roughly 10 to 15 seconds to complete that contraction. As you hit that peak contraction, you're going to fight for just a little bit more. And then from there, we're going to make sure that pelvic tuck does not lose its position, and then we're going to attempt to kick backwards. And this is going to go into full glute squeeze. We're going to crush that glute, and we want to make sure that there is no shift into the lower back. We are absolutely isolating that glute. We can think about reaching through the heel, maximizing hamstring contraction, and trying to squeeze as deeply as possible to open up this extension into the posterior leg tissues, and we're going to crush it for another 5, 4, 3, 2, and then we will relax for a moment. We should be able to re-engage the pelvic tuck and then sink into this a little bit more, and it should feel as though we open up a little bit extra range of motion in our deep hip flexors. You will perform pails and rails of 10 to 15 seconds for a minimum of 2 rounds, upwards to 4 or 5 rounds, depending on what we've recommended. Typically, those contractions should be between 10 and 15 seconds. After you have opened up your hip extension, we will then proceed with hip-controlled articular rotations for a minimum of 2 repetitions, and then you will move on to the rest of your program.